Shalom. I think that's all I know. It's a great honor to be here. It's always great to see child advocates, people who are working to make children's lives better, and I hope that some of the information I have to share with you will help you on that struggle. We can go to the next slide. This project began back in, actually in 1984. I was a new young assistant professor at the University of North Carolina and had the occasion to be invited to Alexandria to teach about public health. And they asked me about my own research, and I explained that I did research on child abuse. And one of the senior pediatricians there politely informed me that that was only an American problem and it didn't happen in Egypt. And then a few years later, I was in Chile doing, again, teaching public health. And I was giving pediatric grand rounds, and they asked me to talk about my own research. And I talked about child abuse, and a senior pediatrician stopped me and explained that that wasn't a problem they had in Chile. It was only an American problem. And so those were the two provocations for this research project that I'll share with you some of the findings. So to begin with, we share an understanding about how we should discipline children, how we should raise children. That's determined by our culture. It's our shared understanding about the right things to do and the way we do things. And even within my own country, there's some regional variations. In the southern part of the United States, having a child go out to the yard to pick a switch that you then hit them with is the way that children are done. In the north, where there's more snow and a shorter season, where you can find a stick on the ground, that's not so much. So it's a negotiable template for how society deals with abuse and neglect. And it's a shared understanding of what it means to be abused or neglected. Next slide. So child abuse is a term that means a lot of things to lots of different people, and even within the same society, different people may think some things are abusive and some are not, and different societies have different perspectives on it. This project, as we got started, we had some arguments about, is this child abuse, is that acceptable, is that not acceptable, would that be child abuse in our country? And so we ended up making a decision as a group of investigators from 15 countries who designed this project that we would ask about behaviors and not ask about define something as abuse. But we'd ask about spanking and slapping and yelling and those kinds of things as a way of trying to understand, and that each country that had the data then could use and define for itself what were the things that were acceptable and not acceptable. And so that was how there are actually very few countries that collect systematic data of official statistics. And so we were designing a project that would collect parallel data from a variety of countries so that we could do it not to see who was the best or who was the worst, but because we thought that some countries might have some ways that they raise children that would be better for child well-being, and that by comparing and contrasting, we could learn more about how the best ways to take care of children all over the world. There is a widespread perception, as I told you in my little stories, that the problem is worse in the US. And the reason for that is we have a very high homicide rate and we have a very high number of movies made about all kinds of things. And so, and television series and CSI and things that make it so it looks like we have a particularly violent society. I don't know if it's really any more violent, and this project was in part designed to answer that question. Next slide. So I was involved with my colleagues then in designing parallel studies in different countries, and I'll first start off with the data from the United States, which we collected in North and South Carolina, two states on the eastern part of the United States, just below Washington. We asked parents using a system called the conflict tactic scale, if they had a need to change their child's behavior or teach them right for wrong, which of the following different techniques did they use? And one of them was slapping and spanking, etc. And you can see that 45% of the parents in North Carolina said that they had spanked their child in the last year. That is actually dramatically different by age. For children between the ages of 3 and 5, it's 80% of children. And then it tapers off for older children. Spanking with an object in the buttocks was about a quarter of the children. Slapping on the face was relatively rare. Pinching was relatively rare. 25% of parents lied and told us they didn't yell at their kids. Taking privileges away and timeout were also common. The next slide. We classified a group of of discipline techniques as particularly harsh. We thought that they would actually meet the definition of child abuse in the United States, in our state anyway. And so we grouped them together in terms of very harsh behaviors. And you can see here on this slide, overall 4.3% of the children in the society were being disciplined with techniques that we thought were exceedingly harsh. And they included shaking a child under 2, beating a child up, which is defined as hitting them over and over again with a closed fist, burning them, kicking them, hitting with an object someplace under the buttocks. And hitting with an object was the most common of those things. In terms of age, you can see that it differed a little bit by age. It turns out that 5 to 9-year-old boys are the children that get it the most, although girls actually overall got more physical abuse than boys did. And the perpetrators, a lot of people think this is a problem that's mostly fathers, but actually mothers do most of the child care and are with the children more. And so actually more of it's done by mothers. Next slide. Lloyd DeMause is a psychohistorian in the United States who wrote a book on the history of child rearing and defined in Western society that there were 5 kind of eras of child rearing. And he talked about in antiquity, he thought the evidence was there that many, if not most, children were put to death or died from punishment or exposure. That it wasn't until the 15th to the 14th century that there was more of abandonment was more common than actual killing. That the 14th to the 17th century in Western Europe was characterized by more of an ambivalent mode. That, remember, people didn't live a real long time. The grandparents weren't around to help as much with child rearing, and people had babies at a pretty young age, so there was a lack of knowledge about how to do it. That the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution was more socialization and socializing mode, and children could be put into the workplace. And Lloyd DeMause argued that it wasn't until just 100 years ago that we became mostly child-centered in the sense that we were focused on trying to protect children. Next slide. Oh, I guess we have it there. Infanticide. Lloyd DeMause was supported by both Plato and Aristotle in their writings, that in ancient Greece, the Council of Elders examined children and deformed children were sacrificed. The Roman law of 12 tables actually forbid the raising of deformed infants. And then the story of Jesus Christ and the slaughter of the innocents was an example of just one of many examples in the Bible of children whose deaths occurred. And a picture of a deformed monster that was put to death. The founding of Rome is the mythology of Remus and Romulus and abandoning children, and the story of Moses is an abandoning of a child in the bulrushes. Founding hospitals were built because the first hospital in Rome and other founding hospitals around the world were founded to take care of children that were abandoned, and there was easy ways to deliver a child that you didn't want and put him in a cradle and turn the lazy Susan inside so that you could abandon the child with complete anonymity. There were even, pediatricians is a relatively recent event, but there were midwives and people who wrote about the proper care of children during the medieval ages, and they had some advice for us. For instance, never have your child wet nursed by a redhead, because apparently the milk gave them a fiery temper, and other kinds of advice like that. They had also advice about how to give a pleasing shape to the limbs and to the head by wrapping in the right way, and how to toughen the skin with cold water, and lots of things that we would consider pretty tough and abusive. So the wet nurses had advice, and the child would go out to a wet nurse early on, would come back and then be with the parents for a few years, and then could be apprenticed off to a trade. So child rearing was actually a relatively short experience for many parents at that time. The ambivalent mode is characterized here by, I think this is Louis XVI, the Sun King, wrapped in his swaddling clothes. And those of you who know about how to quiet babies know that if you wrap them relatively tightly, they quiet down and often go to sleep. If you wrap them tightly enough, it keeps the odors and liquids in so that you don't have to deal with them very commonly. And they even you could hang them up on the wall. And apparently sometimes you could throw them back and forth from one window to the other in games and treat them as a ball or an object. And some of the early medical writings were about how to take care of the injuries that happened from throwing children around in their swaddling. The Industrial Revolution gave an opportunity for children to earn money in the workplace. And here's a picture of a woolen mill in England, a child being beaten by the supervisor in the woolen mill. Next slide. And then, of course, I hear this all the time from parents who are defending the use of corporal punishment on their children, the Proverbs about use of spare the rod, spoil the child, and the use of corporal punishment. And I have to explain to my colleagues who ask me about this, or parents, that this was advice given more than 2,000 years ago at a time when many children were being put to death. And this was pretty avant-garde, new knowledge about how to rear children. And it protected the lives of many, many children who might otherwise have been put to death. But it's long before we know about child development and child psychology, and it's relatively antique advice at this point. Next slide. Children, this is a picture of the Lower East Side of New York and the tenements of New York, and children could be put to work raising, finishing the cuffs and putting buttons on, and families would use the labor of children to help bring income in. A pretty tough time, and if you ever get to New York and see the tenement museum in Lower East Side, it's a very sobering place to understand kind of what life was like. But it was a famous fire in 1911 in which women and children who were doing finishing goods were killed in a fire, and it actually led to the formation of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and some of the first child labor protections. And it was really more related to putting adults back to work than it was to protect children. The Academy of Pediatrics was formed during this period of time, and then in 1962, Henry Kemp wrote a paper with his colleagues called the Battered Child Syndrome, which was exactly 50 years ago in July. That really caused a revolution of attention, not only in the United States, but around the world. And there's a forthcoming book that will be released in Istanbul this fall at the international meeting, talking about, among other things, the impact that paper had in Europe and other parts of the world in recognizing the needs of children. So there are some data, despite what that Egyptian physician told me about the fact that it only had Egyptian dates. And a survey that I reviewed for the WHO, a cross-sectional survey, 37% of children were beaten or tied up in a cross-sectional survey of asking children what they'd experienced. South Korea had that 69 per thousand, or roughly 7% of 4th and 5th grade children reported abuse. But look at the definition. Children was kicking, beating, biting, throwing, or threatening with a knife or gun more than 2 times a month. And in a survey also in South Korea, the 45% reported hitting, kicking, or beating their children in the last month. So very high rates in other countries. Romania, a report that I had the opportunity to get from the WHO, just 4.6% of children reported it, but interestingly, 47% of parents admitted to beating their children regularly, and 16% said they beat them with objects. So very harsh numbers, high numbers in other countries as well. Next slide. So, but one of the difficulties with this is that every study, every new investigation was using different standards and different techniques and different ways of asking the questions. And standardizing the way one asks questions does permit some knowledge. And it's not so much about comparing one country to the other to decide which is worse or which is better, but letting investigators and scientists and child advocates in that country have have some benchmarks to know how they're doing so they can work individually. And so we started a project called World Safe with the International Clinical Epidemiology Network. We met we were at a meeting in Cairo, and we had put a sign up saying, we've been challenged about whether there's a problem of child abuse around the world. Would you like to come together and talk about how to do a study? And we had scientists from 15 countries get together to talk about doing this project, which we called World Studies of Abuse in the Family Environment. We ultimately, that many countries didn't complete the study because they couldn't all find funding to do it. We chose a kind of a standard approach. We're epidemiologists, and we all thought that there needed to be a sampling frame, a kind of using sampling theory to kind of come up with estimates of risk in different countries. Each country had to define a geographic population, and because we couldn't fund them all to do national studies, some did cities, some did parts of cities, but they all had to find a geographic area that they could then use and talk about and represent. A random sample of households, and then within households, if there was more than one mother in the household, they would randomly sample which mother, and then they'd randomly identify which child. And we needed to get the identification of each child so that we would have the answers for what happens to 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And so we began the study that way. We limited our interview to a half hour and developed an instrument that was a common instrument for all the different countries that was a survey instrument. We used female graduate students to go in and do the interviews in each country, and they were done in the home in every country except the United States. And of the countries we were doing it, the United States was the only place that required mandatory reporting of child abuse. And we couldn't figure out a way methodologically to go into a home, ask somebody about something, and not report it as required by law. So we did ours a little bit different in the United States. We did ours by telephone with a system for getting it to be completely anonymous. Here's a listing of the samples. The reason there's so many in India is because the International Council on Research on Women funded a large study because they were interested in domestic violence. And so we included questions about domestic violence, and they were able to get samples in 14 communities in India. And they're ordered here in this slide from the most educated women in the world, Chennai, the non-slum area, where the women average 15.3 years of education, all the way down to the Delhi slums where the women average less than 2 years of education. And you'll see in a few minutes why I organized it that way. Hopefully this slide you can see. But what this is showing is the average years of education. And on this slide, Chennai is up about 15.3, and the US is right behind it, and the Philippines and Delhi were close at that end. At the other end, rural Bhopal and the slums of Delhi were down less than 2 years of education on average for the women. Next slide. So we asked that using the parent-child conflict tactics question, we said, all parents have a need to change their child's behavior to teach them right from wrong, and we're going to ask you a series of questions about things you might have done in the last year with your children. And the normal conflict tactics scale that was developed by Professor Murray Strauss can add up to 20 times or more than 20 times. We made it simple because of the translation issues. We looked at 3 or more, once or twice, or not at all, or I've used it but not in the last year. Next slide. And so there were 36 items in the scale that asked about things including yelling, as I showed you, told the child to stop or start doing something, slapping on the face or head, shaking him or her, hitting the child with an object on the buttocks, hitting the child with an object not on the buttocks, etc. The next slide. And I hope you can see this. This is, I'm not showing the India data here because there's so many communities there. But what you can see here is that on the spanking, as I showed you the data before, it's about 45% in the US, which is the orange. The amber is slapping, and the yellow is hitting with an object, and the green is beating up. And the thing that shows up in this slide in comparison is that, that spanking was actually lowest in the United States of these countries, except for Egypt. But Egypt also had 25% of the children were described as being beat up. And when we saw those data, I called Fatma Hassan at Suez Canal University, who did the field survey work there, and said, we must have done something wrong with our Arabic translation because it can't possibly be right. And she said, no, she thought the data were in fact correct. And we also analyzed it further for socioeconomic status and showed it was the upper income families that were harshest on children in Ismailia, the sample that was there. Because a child who misbehaves in public brings great shame on a family, and it was the upper income families that cared. And these are the slums of Bhopal, and what you can see here is that spanking is relatively common. Slapping is actually more common than spanking in a number of communities. But as you can see, these are ordered in education, and the green bar is beating up. And the lower education of the mothers, the more beating up there is. So the really harsh forms of discipline really are dramatically, and I'll show you another slide that shows that a little bit better. We can go to the next slide. So in 11 of the 14 Indian communities, slapping on the face was actually more common than spanking. In the United States, slapping on the face is considered a great insult and relatively rare, but it's actually much more common in India. In Brazil, Chile, and the Philippines, spanking was more common. And then we had the beating up thing in Egypt that we had first tried to, thinking that it wasn't actually accurate data, but it turned out it was. And what I've noticed as I did a report for WHO, Ethiopia also had a high rate on upper income families of being injured or beaten up. In terms of non-physical discipline, I already told you that there are a fair number of parents who lie and tell us they don't yell, but you can see that yelling is actually pretty common in all the countries. That's the orange bar, and so it ranges from a low of 65 up to about 90% of, or almost 90% of families yell at their children. Timeout is relatively uncommon in other countries, except the Philippines was using more of it. And taking privileges away was something that we did mostly in the US, and really they didn't do it all in the Philippines, and relatively small proportion in Egypt and Brazil. The next slide. And this was the India data on that. It's harder to see a pattern here in terms of education, that it's kind of, that most families yelled at their children in India as well. So yelling appears to be the universal. I guess that doesn't surprise any of us. So yelling is frequent. Timeout was less common in developing countries. And just Chile and the United States and one Indian slum did a lot of taking privileges away, but otherwise that wasn't a very common technique either. So the other thing we asked, there's a question on the conflict tactic scale about shaking a child to discipline, and we decided to take a look at this because I've become very concerned about shaken infant syndrome in the United States, or shaken baby syndrome. And we looked because we were startled to find that 2.6% of North and South Carolina parents shake their child under 2 to discipline them. We thought that was alarmingly high. And then when we asked the question in other communities, you can see that the numbers get astronomical, with a number of the communities being over 60%, several of the communities being over 60% of babies are being shaken. We don't know what the consequences of this is, and one of the things we asked was, do they all mean the same thing, or does some just mean bouncing on the knee or jostling? Or do they really mean shaking vigorously back and forth? And the focus group we did in India suggests that what they meant is shaking back and forth vigorously, but we don't know that for sure yet. That needs further research. But alarmingly high rates in a country in India that has only had one case report of a shaken baby syndrome and had kind of no recognition. But of course, children don't get autopsied, and many children don't get taken to medical care when they're dying, so that they may actually not know. In terms of just the overall rate of punishment, you remember I organized this in terms of education, and so the highest education is over there on your left, and then all the way to the right is lowest education. And I think the thing here is the overall trend line is that the more educated the women are, the less violence the children experience. To the point, and the median is 15% of children. The median in this study, 15% of children are being harshly physical punishment, which is probably an estimate that we could apply to the world's children and be not too far off if 15% of the world's children are basically abused each year in that kind of context. But one of the things that this suggests for a strategy for prevention of child abuse is education of girls and women. And the delayed childbearing and education of women and girls would probably by itself have a dramatic reduction in abuse and neglect. Next slide. So more than 10% of the children, infants, were shaken in every community but in the US and the city of Chennai. We don't know if that causes intellectual harm or learning disabilities, but there is a report from the US Institute of Medicine that was looking at brain development in the developing world and commented about the unexplained epidemic of mental retardation among the poor in lower income countries, and particularly mentioned India as a place that has an unexplained epidemic of mental retardation among the poor. And so I think this merits more investigation. And finally, I was just going to point out to you that there has been a world report on children and violence that was done by the Secretary General, his study commission, and one of the things we observed was there's a paucity of data collected that's comparable in different countries. Most countries don't have population-based data, and trying to decide, even in countries like the United States that do have national reporting data, who gets caught has more to do with kind of where they take their children for care and how close their neighbors live than necessarily what they do in terms of behavior. So surveys asking parents, or even other surveys asking children what's going on, may be ways to understand more of what's going on. I'm sorry, you want to go back? So we need some survey data, survey interest. There's been a paucity of that kind of work done in different countries, and so we actually, as a result of the Secretary General's project, the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect took on the task of leading in the development of a set of instruments to measure child abuse and neglect. And we've developed 3 of them called the ICAST, or ISPACAN Child Abuse Screening Tools. And there is a parent version similar to the Parent-Child Conflict Tactics Scale. There is a youth version that's designed to be given to children who've just left childhood to report back on what happened to them as children, that gets around some of the legal constraints in some countries of asking children directly about it. And then there is a child version for actually asking children about what they've experienced that's been studied in some countries. And so those are 3 sets of instruments. So they're complementary, they're multinational. They were actually developed with more scientists from the south than the north and trying to balance and make sure that they were comparable in different countries. They're intended to drive research and policy and investigation. And I can tell you now that I think we're up to 29 countries where there are people using those instruments, including in close by you. There's been a discussion about doing it in Palestine. We're doing it, helping Bahrain do it. We're helping Saudi Arabia do a national study. And Palestine has been talking about it with us. And Egypt has done a couple of studies. So there's some places close by you that have collected data. And so there is now a toolkit of these instruments with guides and data entry templates, and actually the translated versions that have been translated into a number of languages that are available from the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. And so that's an unpaid advertisement for that set of instruments. Next slide. So we've done some pilot testing of these instruments, and the pilot testing has been published in the international journal called Child Abuse and Neglect. And the pilot testing has been done in a variety of countries. The children's instrument was the one that was hardest to pilot test because of some of the legal constraints, but Iceland and Russia and India and Colombia have all done pilot studies of that. Next slide. So the field studies have collected about 120 children or parents in each of the studies. They had local ethical review and focus groups and local data entry and central cleaning and analysis. And there have been some publications now. You can go to the next slide. And I just picked a couple of them, little things that we thought were significant. This is the children reporting on parents said they wished you were dead. 5% in Colombia, 11% in India, and almost 20% of the kids were told that in Russia, and a smaller percentage in Iceland. So interesting and actually pretty devastating in terms of that, how children are being treated. Next slide. Sexual victimization, again, our sample in Russia seemed to lead the pack in terms of sexual victimization, with 18% said that an adult tried to have sex with them. And physical victimization was, Lebanon and Colombia were quite high. Next slide. So these studies are underway, and I would encourage and be happy to collaborate and help encourage studies that might be done of children. And because you're in emergency shelters, one of the instruments that's developed, the child instrument, there is an institutional version to kind of see how children are being treated in institutional care. And there are investigators around the world that are very interested in kind of children in group homes, children in jails, children in other settings outside the home or in boarding schools. And so that instrument's designed for that. And I think we're about done. So I think in summary, there is a world perception that the US seems to have more of a problem. And the Chilean physician explained to me that if you looked in the medical literature, all the articles on child abuse are from the United States. And so that was his evidence of why it was an American problem. But I think the answer now is that not all the articles are from the United States, that investigators in other countries are also publishing. There actually looks like low and middle income children have, low and middle income countries may actually have a greater problem, not a lesser problem. And that actually makes sense because women's education and opportunities for girls seem to be one of the things that we could lead as an international policy that would actually reduce violence against children around the world. And I'll stop there and just say thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take questions if you have them.